everybody, Justin here, and we're back for another fantastic Whiteboard Wednesday. And so today we're looking at uncovering the intricacies of histamine intolerance. Now, admittedly, this is not something that I've had a lot of experience with in the past. And I started to dig more into this because I saw a lot of our clients with autoimmune disease have histamine issues. Okay, so it really made sense for me to really gain some knowledge on this and then share with you what I've learned from integrating these sort of different interventions and how I go about it with you guys. Okay, so histamine, as you probably know, is a chemical that most of you are familiar with that's really associated with allergic reactions, right? But it's also secreted during inflammation, right? From these mast cells, these immune cells, and your basophils, which are also immune cells. So if you have an infection or injury, this also will occur where you release histamine. Now, it's a chemical we're exposed to from food as well, and we make it daily actually. And most of us who are healthy have the capacity to break it down so it doesn't cause any issues or symptoms. But it's considered to be a pathological process when there's a poor ability to break down histamine in the body. In the gut, that is. And for some people, that is the case, where just eating seemingly innocuous, harmless foods trigger histamine release and create this influx of unabated histamine. And so the typical symptoms you may have experienced when you have histamine intolerance are, of course, itching, watery eyes, sneezing, things that you typically experience when you have allergies, right? And the reason why is because these allergens, they bind mast cells, they stimulate histamine release. But surprisingly, histamine issues are related to a whole host of other things even beyond this, but things like eczema. Definitely have had autoimmune skin clients who have histamine issues, eczema being one of them, acne, rashes, fatigue, joint pain, of course, a lot of gut stuff, bloating, even reflux, okay? And edema, insomnia, diarrhea, tachycardia, which is, accelerated heart rate, depression, anxiety, irritability, headaches. Mood, neurological disorders are pretty common too, especially brain fog and headaches. So naturally, histamine acts as a neurotransmitter, but it's also an immune modulator. That's why histamine impacts a lot of different areas of the body, hence all these symptoms that could really just be anywhere, but mostly neurologically in the brain and in the gut. And so for women, oftentimes before ovulation, they experience histamine type related issues or symptoms like headaches, anxiety, heavy periods, mood swings, right after ovulation or during their menses. And you'll see why in a little bit. Okay, so let's check out some of the causes or mechanisms behind histamine intolerance. Now, I've more or less narrowed it down to 3 central things that we have, I think, largely missed. Now, if we address this, though, it can make huge strides in managing and reversing our histamine intolerance. Now, bear in mind, there may be other factors out there that we have not found in science yet. And I will admit that there probably are other things that I'm even unaware of, okay? But for the time being, this is what I found to be helpful, and that's why we're going to talk about this, okay? So this is a great starting point where we're going here. And the first one is dysbiosis, okay? Bacterial overgrowth, SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Believe it or not, bacteria, we all have it in us, obviously. They're all making histamine, okay? So we're never really avoiding it. However, if you have overgrowth of bugs, well, naturally makes sense. You're probably going to have more histamine in your body, right? So overgrowth of bugs like bacteria in SIBO creates an overload of histamine. That's one secret there, where if you have SIBO going on, there's definitely a possibility that SIBO is what's contributing to histamine issues for you. So if you have a lot of bacteria in your gut, that can create a lot of histamine. That's one thing. Now the other side of this is that if you have SIBO or Candida, which I'm sure you've heard of before, fungus overgrowth, this can both lead to a term you're also probably familiar with, leaky gut. Okay, now in either situation, This is a problem because bacteria, gram-negative bacteria, they secrete metabolites, endotoxins, when they lysis, when they die, okay? And this can damage the gut, cause hyperpermeability. Now, these endotoxins can also get into the blood and alarm the immune system, potentially releasing or promoting histamine release from the mast cells. That's a problem in a whole different discussion in the case of autoimmunity, for example. But either way, this is how you can end up with leaky gut. Now, Candida can do the same because it has these root-like structures which really tear at the gut wall, and that can cause hyperpermeability too. Now, consequently, there's a deficit of this enzyme known as DAO. Okay, DAO is diamine oxidase, and that's an enzyme that breaks down histamine. Okay, so dysbiosis and overgrowth of microbes reduces the ability to break down histamine because of this phenomenon, right? That's one real plausible hidden cause that I think is really overlooked. So histamine intolerance can be an indication of poor gut health, essentially. Now bear in mind that bacteria and yeast overgrowth, right, they provoke the immune system, like I said, especially when they get out into the blood or they have endotoxins like the bacteria that get into the blood and they activate immune cells, or they activate dendritic cells, which are in your gut too. Now ultimately they can activate histamine release from mast cells or basophils, and overall anything that activates the immune system aside from these microbes can trigger histamine release, which brings me to the next point, and that would be environmental toxicants. If necessary, we should really consider environmental triggers if nothing else improves from a gut restoration standpoint. So sometimes as the gut improves, and this has been proven to me with clients, toxins and all these external exogenous things we're exposed to, chemicals, they become less of a problem, but not always, because the gut improves, right? We're able to clear this stuff out better, our detoxification process moves better, our liver moves better, our lymphatic system is flowing better, right? But it's worth considering that mycotoxicity from mold, right? Lyme disease, what else? Bartonella, co-infections, Ehrlichia, Mycoplasma, Babesia, metals, and even stress and trauma, right? All this stuff can really cause a lot of havoc, flares, more histamine issues potentially, especially the mold and Lyme bacteria co-infection stuff, right? So if you aren't finding improvements with healing your gut and everything we're talking about here, then you're going to want to really consider this, okay? Especially also factoring in your history and what you've been exposed to. Because again, if they activate immune cells, especially mold and infections, which are really, really common, and for a lot of people, they can seriously exacerbate histamine intolerance. Now, nonetheless, we still want to optimize the gut, but we simultaneously want to, reduce exposure to the mold, the infections, right, and handle them properly. And thirdly, we have estrogen dominance. Okay, so estrogen does a lot of things in the body, but one thing I think we miss is that estrogen actually can increase histamine production and decrease diamine oxidase enzyme output from the gut. So estrogen dominance is a frequently seen occurrence in women, and it's largely due to a couple things. And in my opinion, from what I've seen, it's poor clearance of estrogen. Not to get too much on a side tangent, it's poor clearance of estrogen from the body, right? The gut, the liver, something like that is not working optimally. It's too much xenoestrogen exposure, plastics, BPA, phthalates, all these toxins that are deemed, estrogen mimickers. However, inflammation, right, from all this other stuff that you may have going on as well, inflammation from any source can increase aromatization, which is basically the conversion of testosterone androgens into estrogen. And that just compounds the problem, does it not? So this is something you may want to consider if you feel nothing is getting better from a gut health perspective. Oftentimes, I've seen this with women who have histamine intolerance. They feel worse, like I said, I think before, during menses or just before their period, right? And so estrogen can definitely fuel that histamine fire, which implies that this is much more than just reducing histamine, high histamine foods from your diet, right? So if you're listening to this, you're probably thinking like, okay, Justin, you're saying that it's not so much about changing your diet or supplements or meds, so what are you suggesting then? Okay, so let me preface by saying that the go-to treatments for histamine intolerance are generally, as you would expect, antihistamines through over-the-counter H1 and H2 blockers, maybe even natural stuff like botanicals, and then of course a low histamine type diet. That's not to say that those things don't work and aren't helpful, they definitely are. However, there are many other things that really deserve more attention, and truthfully, if you address these other things that I'm going to mention here, perhaps you may not need to rely so heavily on the low or the histamine foods, the meds, and the natural supplements and stuff like that. Okay, so the first thing here we'll talk about is diet. I know you're thinking, you just mentioned it's not about histamine foods. Okay, but here's the deal. We talked about SIBO being a potential issue, right? Well, guess what fuels SIBO? High FODMAP. Okay? So if you know what that diet is, a low FODMAP diet is really what we're trying to advocate for potential SIBO issues, which you can run a hydrogen methane breath test for. And so a low FODMAP diet consists of things you probably know, right? It's eliminating basically apples and fructose, apples, pears, lactose, right? Dairy, fructans, which are in asparagus, Brussels sprouts, artichoke beets, cabbage, onions, and grains like wheat and rye, and legumes, right? Beans, lentils, and then sugar alcohols. So sorbitol, what else? Xylitol, those types of things, okay? So we definitely want to consider doing a low FODMAP diet, and then potentially we want to do a paleo, which has some overlap here, right? Removing legumes, dairy, wheat, grains, things like that. Because, like I said before, if you have SIBO, the low FODMAP diet is generally what works and creates symptom relief. And I've seen this oftentimes where you don't even actually need to run a test. Because if clients start feeling better when you integrate a low FODMAP diet, it's almost like a diagnosis in and of itself. It tells me that there's something going on, and I've been fortunate enough to handle SIBO just by having this sort of approach and not testing, because the client didn't want to do it, didn't want to pay for it, whatever the reason is. All right. Now, after this stuff, okay, I mean paleo, basically because there are a lot of, provocative foods in a paleo diet that can trigger the immune system. That's why we're doing that. Sometimes in conjunction with this, sometimes we can do either one. Now, if neither of those are really working, then you can start to integrate a low histamine diet, which means we're really just avoiding the highest histamine-containing foods that we know of, and we don't know all of them, but we do know some, and there are things like avocado and tomatoes and fermented foods and wine and alcohol and eggplant and vinegar and dairy. So that's my thoughts there on diet. So you're trying to cycle through 2 or 3 different types, maybe doing all 3 at once and kind of seeing what sticks. And then naturally we have to consider the gut, right? Okay, so optimizing gut health is more than just dealing with potential pathogens like fungus, SIBO, things like that, but restoring leaky gut with emulsants, probiotics, potentially sporebiotics, Saccharomyces boulardii, which is a beneficial type of yeast, checking for a low stomach acid, pancreatic enzyme deficiency, considering bile support, assessing liver detoxification, kidney and gallbladder evaluation, right? Those things too, depending on the symptoms and any sort of clinical evidence from labs. In my experience with people who have histamine intolerance, I find that a lot of them usually need pancreatic enzyme, digestive enzyme support. Stomach acid, hit or miss. People who have reflux or GERD, they generally have low stomach acid, so they need HCl support there. Bile is also tricky because, so say for example, if you have low back pain or itchy skin, there's a chance that you may have cholestasis or poor bile flow. The reason being is that toxins in the liver, they have kind of like a back door. So toxins can kick out if they're not being detoxified and getting to the bile and moving into the duodenum and small intestine to be excreted, okay? So low back pain and itchy skin where, again, bile is getting out in a different way and it's getting into your system, and that's how you can have itchy skin. So anyway, those are signs for me that, and of course brain fog might be related to that as well, but and obviously an inability to digest fatty foods. So those are all clues for me that there may be some bile issues. At the autoimmunerevolution.com website, we have digestive formula, which contains enzymes, ox bile, and HCl. So all things that help with everything I'm talking about right now, which is really cool. So that's something to consider if you feel like you may need that. Let's check out now the botanicals and the natural stuff for histamine. So before I get into that, we should also bear in mind that botanicals and things like that and meds for your potential candida, right, like nystatin or rifaximin for SIBO, whatever, it's up for you and your doctor to figure out. But that's stuff that you're also going to want to address, obviously. But nonetheless, we have natural things that act as natural antihistamines. So you probably have heard of these: quercetin, luteolin, right, vitamin D, and vitamin C, and then glutathione, abbreviated GSH. Okay, so these are all really helpful, which can all be really useful, but not at the expense of ignoring the aforementioned areas. So luteolin is one I think is really like the underdog, in my opinion. And the reason why, and I like to use it a lot, honestly. And actually, what it does is pretty awesome because it actually prevents not only mast cell degranulation, but it reduces airway mucus production for those who have respiratory problems. It decreases cytokine activity, which they mediate inflammation, and it can cross the blood-brain barrier, which is cool if you got anxiety or neurological issues. Surprisingly, of all the flavonoids that we know of, I think, for antihistamine purposes, the research has shown that luteolin exhibits the best inhibitory effects on mast cells. It's more effective than the highly praised quercetin, actually. And it's also worth mentioning that iron deficiency is something that can be a problem in this histamine intolerance sort of puzzle. You really want to consider it because, especially if you have symptoms, right, or you're a vegan or a vegetarian, maybe. Checking ferritin levels and making sure, at least for me, I make sure that they're above a 90. And the reason being is that iron has a role in controlling mast cells. Now, final thing here, I'll talk about over-the-counter H1 and H2 blockers, like Claritin, Zyrtec, Pepcid. You know, these are things that may be needed if you do everything else, and you really just need acute relief. I get that, right? So while they might help in those situations, you may feel inclined to use them, which is great. No shame in that. They are still Band-Aids at the end of the day when the root problems are probably still there, right? You can see why. One final thing. Okay, so testing for this DAO enzyme that I know is something people know about and consider, I'll personally tell you it is not something that I'm really interested in. We do not have a fully validated, diagnostic criteria that's shown in the research at this point for histamine intolerance. We don't. We have guidelines for DAO levels, but I find that it's pretty apparent when someone's got histamine intolerance. When someone comes in and they have all these issues and we reduce the histamine load through food and we dress it as I mentioned before, and they start improving. I am even more or less interested in genetic testing for any sort of SNPs or mutations or whatever in that DAO gene, because I don't think the approach changes. I could be wrong there, but I haven't found it helpful, especially in your wallet. All right, so that concludes today's Whiteboard Wednesday on histamine intolerance. I hope you found that helpful and you got some gems out of this and you have something that you can take away and implement for yourself. if you have histamine intolerance. If you have somebody in your family or someone you know who has it, you can share that with them and maybe have them watch this video too. So if you have any questions, of course, though, feel free to reach out to me at justin@theautoimmunerevolution.com, and you can find me on Instagram, of course, at JustinJanoska. All right. Thank you, as always, for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time.